This is TokyoReal. I'm Ian Simpson, and today this is our first show, and we're very pleased to have Graham Jones with us. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me on your very first show, Ian. And it's an honour to be here. And of course, the good news for you is that after me, the only way is up for you. So anyway, I'm looking forward to see what you do with this project. It's very exciting.
Yes, well, thank you. We're honoured to have you here. So maybe just for the viewers, let me say a few things about you first. You graduated with a degree in astrophysics from London University. You've taught in English in 6 continents. You've worked in politics as a constituency agent for 2 members of the UK Parliament. In business, you're director and part owner of a UK-based interpreting and translation company. Presently now, you are based in Japan, as we can see from the studio decor here,
Yes.
which is very traditional. You're doing some teaching at Shiga University, and you're involved in 2 interesting and exciting projects, Skype Read and Global Communication and Science. Would that be you?
That's me. That's it. Yes. Yes.
So, okay, well, basically today we're gonna have a chat about English and its as a tool for global communication and collaboration, which is what your real expertise is. Yeah.
That's the area where I'm kind of doing some work at the moment. Yes.
So,
yes.
are you saying to me that just English is not just, hey, let's teach someone to speak English and they can speak English? It's something a bit deeper than that?
Well, I think the interesting thing with English these days is that I think it can be helpful if we do stop thinking about English as being a language and really start to see it much more as a tool for global collaboration. And I think if we think about it more in that way, that can be helpful for teachers, for students, and really for anybody that uses English as part of their work.
Right. And so pretty much the English, historically English has been based around British English and London and England. Is that still the case?
Well, no. I mean, I think that within English, there has been something of a Copernican revolution within English.
That sounds interesting.
Well, as you mentioned, actually, my degree is in astrophysics, and sometimes people do ask me if there's any kind of connection between astrophysics and English teaching. And I think one of the interesting connections is this thing called the Copernican principle. Now, in astronomy, the Copernican principle is one of the most important ideas that there is. It's named after the 16th century Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus, who he was the guy that proposed that the Earth was not the center of the universe, and that all of the kind of bodies in the heavens do not all rotate around the Earth.
Right.
Now, today, the Copernican principle says that in the universe there are no special observers. What that means is that we can explain how the universe works without having to assume that the Earth or any other location in the universe occupies a central or special position. Now, I think if you look at the English language, then 500 years ago, English was spoken by about 3 million people, and the center of the English-speaking world was very definitely London.
Yes.
And the whole language rotated around Chaucer and Shakespeare and
that's sort of our traditional image of English, isn't it? The Shakespearean and the poetry and historical roots of it. That's the image we have.
Absolutely. And 500 years ago that was absolutely the case, that London was firmly culturally, politically, it was absolutely the center of the language. Now, over time, as the British Empire kind of carried the language around the globe, other centers of the language were created. So in the 20th century, for example, the language was now also revolving around people like Roosevelt and Kennedy and Dr. Martin Luther King.
Right.
Now, if we come into the 21st century, today English is spoken by about 2 billion people around the world, and non-native speakers outnumber native speakers by at least 3 to 1.
Yeah, that statistic in itself surprised me. 3 to 1 non-native speakers to native speakers.
At least 3 to 1.
Yes.
At least 3 to 1. I mean, it has been a true Copernican revolution. Native speakers are no longer the center of the English-speaking universe.
Right.
Now, there is a story that illustrates that point. This is a story that's told by Richard Pooley, who's a cross-cultural communications consultant. He tells the story of Korean Air, and they were buying some flight simulators, and they were talking to a British company and a French company. Now, one of the things when you buy flight simulators is that you have to give your pilots training on how to use them. And of course, that training is given in English. So the Koreans were negotiating with the British and with the French, and all of the negotiations took place in English, of course. And the Koreans realized that they could understand the French speaking English better than they could understand the British speaking English.
Right.
And of course, they thought, well, these companies are going to be giving training to our pilots. We understand the French better than we understand the British. So, all other things being more or less equal, they gave the contract to the French company, because the French company, their English was better. Although we shouldn't really say better, of course.
Better.
Because in a Copernican world, of course, the whole point is that there is really no such thing as better. But what we could say is that the Koreans found the French easier to understand when they were speaking English, and that's why they got the contract.
Yes, good point. I don't think we'll ever say that the French speak better English than us, and if it's thought that they do, please don't tell them.
But
We'll never hear the last of it.
Well, yeah, exactly.
But so what implications does this have for us as teachers and students?
Well, I think one of the big implications is that there always tends to be this idea that native English or native-like English is the goal for students, or even if it's not the goal, then it's kind of the guide for students. And I think that that's not always the case. For example, when I was working in Spain, I was working with a winemaker and exporter. He was called Oscar.
Right, that sounds like a good job. Yeah.
That was, what he made. He still makes absolutely fantastic wine, and he sells a lot of his wine overseas. Now, one day he was practicing a presentation with me in English, and it was just a fantastic presentation. He talked about the history and tradition of winemaking in his part of Spain. He talked about the soil and climate and geology and topography and all of those kinds of things. He talked about his family and their roots in the local community going back many generations. It was a brilliant presentation. But at the end of it, Oscar wasn't happy. And I said, well, what's wrong? And he said, it's my accent. He said, my accent is so Spanish. I sound so Spanish. I really need to work on my accent and make it sound less Spanish. Now, I said to him, Oscar, you've just spent, the last 40 minutes explaining to me in great detail how where you're from is the key to what you do. It's really the secret to your success. Your accent is just very much part of where you're from and who you are. Why would making it sound less Spanish be advantageous to you?
There can be something special about accents, speaking English in a different accent. Personally, I quite like it. Some accents you like and some you don't, yeah. Is there a difference between pronunciation and accent? For example, we live in Japan and we have, I mean, you got kids, I've got kids, and I don't know about your kids, but my kids, sometimes they're speaking English in katakana English. So they're going, Dad, are we going to going to ride on the boto today? Do I have to wear my hatto? And, you know, I'm getting angry saying, hey, come on, speak properly. Your father's British, speak properly, you know? Is there a difference between accent and pronunciation, do you think? Does it matter?
Well, I mean, I think you've got to, I mean, it's the whole thing of, I mean, there's accent, there's pronunciation, there's, you know, there's kind of sentence stress patterns, there's intonation. I mean, there's actually so much that goes into how a language sounds.
So is it all about the fact that as long as we can understand each other, that's all that really matters? Is that the bottom line?
Well, that's the key thing. Now, I mean, of course, the key thing with Oscar, of course, is that, I mean, if his Spanish accent was so strong that, in fact, it was difficult to understand, then, of course, clearly, you know, that's no good. But, I mean, the point of that story is that, you know, aiming for a native-like accent, you know, is not necessarily the goal there. It's not even necessarily, you know, a helpful guide.
Oh, we're both from Britain, yeah, and I'm sure you've been on numerous either soccer excursions or rugby excursions to Edinburgh and Dublin for the rugby internationals, and the amount of times I've been drinking beer in a bar in Dublin, talking to some old boy by the side of me, and I turned to my mate and said, "Can you understand a word he is saying?" You go to Glasgow, Scotland. Sometimes you can't understand what they're saying, and they're British. So yeah, I get the point. It's if it's understandable, maybe it's acceptable.
Well, that's the key thing, and I mean, of course, that also, I mean, that goes back to the whole point as well of this kind of Copernican world of English. You know, even if you're aiming for native-like English, you know, which, you know, what does that actually mean?
Yes.
You know, and to be honest, I mean, you can't really say that a Glaswegian accent or Oscar's Spanish accent or, you know, an American accent. The whole point of this idea of thinking in terms of this kind of Copernican world of English is to say that actually, you know, none of these accents can be taken to be the kind of the true, correct accent. There is no center to the English language anymore. It is just now this global communications tool, and you cannot point to one accent and say, you know, that is the standard English accent.
That's right. We've now got students coming to our schools and universities who are saying, you say, why do you want to learn English? They say, I'm going travelling in Europe, or I'm going travelling in China, which really are not English-speaking countries, but they want English to go and communicate in other countries like China or Korea or Europe.
It's exactly it. I mean, students these days, by and large, are not learning the language because they want to talk to, you know, Brits or Americans or, you know, native speakers. Exactly. I mean, they're learning it because, exactly, they want to use it for talking to people in Asia, in Europe, in Latin America. You know, they want to talk to the 1.5 billion people in the world for whom English is not a language. It is simply a tool for global communication.
So for our viewers who are English teachers or language teachers of any kind, how does that impact on them? How can they change their thinking in the way they deliver the language?
Well, I mean that's an excellent question. Of course, I mean, I think that's really the big question. I mean, I find it quite helpful with some of my students to kind of go right back to first principles with communication. You know, 2,500 years ago, Aristotle kind of set down the kind of the fundamental principles of communication in his book On Rhetoric. Now, the interesting thing is that really at no time in the kind of subsequent 2,500 years has anybody really been able to improve on Aristotle's kind of basic ideas. He proposed that there were kind of 3 fundamental means of persuasion, 3 ways that we kind of communicate and persuade people of our ideas. The first of these is ethos, and this is persuasion through character. If we want somebody to listen to us, we have to be credible, and we have to be believable. He also said that there's pathos, which is persuasion through emotion, or kind of creating feelings of emotion within the listener. Aristotle understood that decision making is very emotional, yes. And that human beings really never make entirely rational or sensible decisions. And then the third element is logos, which really looks at the words we use and the arguments we employ to persuade somebody. Okay. So those three things, ethos, pathos, and logos, I think they can be kind of an interesting framework for looking at how well somebody communicates. I mean, if we go back to Oscar, for example, in Spain, now his Spanish accent, that really boosted his ethos and his pathos. With his ethos, his accent gave him more kind of authority and more kind of authenticity for talking about these Spanish wines. It boosted his pathos. It actually made him much more engaging and much more likable as a person. Yeah. Sometimes with my students, we kind of look at communication through that kind of prism, through that framework of Aristotle, and it can lead to some interesting results.
Yes, yeah. And talk to me about the projects that you're involved in. I know they're quite exciting and they're quite new projects, and how they link with astrophysics and.
Yeah.
You're doing Skype read and you're doing global communication and science. Yeah. So
that's right.
What's that all about?
Yeah. Well, so yes, the idea of these projects is really kind of in this kind of Copernican world of English, that we live in. The idea there is really to try to get people out of a classroom environment and into much more of a global, interactive environment. Right. I think there are kind of two important trends going on at the moment. I think one is that the English-speaking world is becoming increasingly Copernican. I think the other interesting trend that there is that communication is becoming increasingly remote. Again, when we look at students in Japan, just as they're not learning English and to talk to native English speakers, if you look ahead to the situations where they are going to be using English, increasingly it's not using English in face-to-face situations. It's using English for remote communication. We're talking about things like email and Skype and other online platforms.
More than ever in the future. More and more, I guess.
Well, exactly. Now, of course, technology is fantastic, and the possibilities and the opportunities that this creates is, absolutely amazing and wonderful. But remote communication does bring its own set of challenges as well. They tend to fall into two areas. Firstly, on the language side, remote communication is not easy. There are quite a few studies, for example, that show how difficult it is to successfully convey tone and emotion on email, for example.
Yeah, very difficult.
Absolutely. And of course, on the other side, of course, there's the cultural question as well. I think that the cultural side has been put very well by Nancy Adler, she's a professor of management at McGill University in Montreal, and she says that interconnectedness through modern technology has really deluded many people, because it's created this kind of false assumption that just because it's so easy to talk to anyone anywhere in the world by email or by Skype, then we are therefore all the same, and of course we're not. And the cultural challenges are definitely acute in terms of remote communication.
It's a very 2D environment, isn't it? How do we bring it to life then? If I'm talking to you on Skype, how do I bring it to life?
Right. How do you bring things to life? How do you help people to kind of develop relationships and empathy and all that kind of stuff? Absolutely, absolutely. Well, I mean, again, I think that's really one of the big challenges that there is. You mentioned a couple of the projects that I've been working on. I mean, one of those projects, which is Skype Read, our aim there is to try to bring these kind of remote interactions to life through movie read-throughs. Okay. This is where we have a small group of non-native speakers that we bring together from different countries in a Skype group call, and we do a read-through of a movie script.
Okay.
Now, a read-through is actually part of the. It's part of the.
They do it anyway, yeah. Before, when they're practicing for movies in Hollywood.
That's right.
Right?
It's part of the film production process. It's kind of before shooting begins. You know, basically all of the actors in the movie sit down around a big table. Kind of together with other key personnel like directors and producers and script writers, and the actors simply read through the script, and it's a very powerful exercise for making sure that everybody understands what the movie is about, and also it's a very good way of making sure that the script really works and all the different elements and all the different characters kind of fit together in a coherent way. Now, the idea of doing this with non-native speakers on Skype, when people first hear about this, they do tend to raise their eyebrows a bit. But actually, you know what? I think it's a very powerful exercise, because actually I think there's a lot that we can all learn from the movie industry.
And it's enjoyable, because people love movies. Everybody loves a movie.
Well,
so motivated learning is good learning.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, you said there that, everybody loves movies. I mean, one of the great things about the movie industry is that they are so good at creating products that, really everybody likes. Movies that work across, so many different countries and across so many different cultures. Michael Linton, who's the chief executive of Sony Pictures, he said that, today, big Hollywood pictures really have no national ideology attached to them at all. They really are, designed as products that can work across, any culture.
That's good for business, of course.
It's great for business, and for this kind of thing, using movies in this kind of, in these kind of, for these multicultural collaboration activities, makes it extremely powerful.
So how would it work? If I joined your group, you would give me a role within the script that I should learn and read when I come online?
That's right. So we normally have small groups of about 5 or 6 participants, and each person reads 2 or 3 characters within the movie. So yes, you kind of have your roles.
And you encourage them to ham it up and use an accent, be they playing a woman or a man or a child or.
Well, the interesting thing is that actually we tell people that they can take whatever approach they like. If they want to ham it up, then that's absolutely great. Or alternatively, if they want to play it very deadpan and read their lines in a very deadpan voice, we say that's also okay. But the interesting thing we find is that, as soon as we're a few pages into the script, it's amazing that the whole thing comes alive and everybody just very naturally gets into their characters. And, we've seen some great acting. People really, becoming their roles. And it's a wonderful transformation that happens very quickly once this process starts.
I see. Why I like the idea of this is that many of our students, particularly in Japan, Japanese people in particular, are very shy and very reserved about, reluctant to express themselves And it's a big problem when you're trying to teach them a language. Basically, the best way to learn a language is to get out there and just do it, just speak it. But if they won't open their mouth and they won't speak because they're self-conscious of themselves, what I'm thinking is if they take on another, if you say to them, you're not yourself, take on another persona, you are this person, does that make a big difference? Do they do that? Do they suddenly come out of their shell?
Yeah, but absolutely. And you know, but I mean, you can see this particularly with Japanese students doing this exercise, who, as you say, very often they do tend to start off, you know, rather shy about the whole thing. I mean, because it does feel very weird at the beginning for everybody, and you know, everybody is very nervous at the start.
Yes.
But I mean, you know,
they get into it. Yeah.
You know, people get into it so quickly. I mean, of course, the other great thing is that people are reading from a script, and you know, one of the challenges, you know, normally with speaking a foreign language is that, you know, you're spending so much of your kind of mental processing trying to think of the words to say, and you know, trying to work out how you can fit yourself into a conversation or a discussion. Because when the words are there and you actually have no choice in the words, I mean, first of all, you get your turn, you have to deliver, and it really does free you up for thinking about, you know, the other areas of communication, you know, how you're sounding, how you're expressing the words, and you can really think about the whole kind of communication picture and not just be worrying, you know, about the words you're using. So it's a very kind of, it's a very liberating experience.
Again, I'm trying to think outside the box. Could we take this into industry, use it with leadership skills, developing management teams, communication within management teams? Is that a...
Oh, you know, this kind of thing works, you know, extremely well in that kind of, you know, sort of business world. You know, as a communications activity, as a team building activity,
yes,
you know, it's incredibly powerful. You know, actually,
it breaks down the roles, doesn't it? I'm no longer the president, and you're no longer the office lady, the office man, or the office lady. You could be playing any role, and you have to play the role. So you could be shouting at your president or whatever, and he would have to accept it. And so, yeah, as you say, it probably builds those bonds and improves teamwork and communication.
It really does. It really does. In fact, when I was researching the project, I did an interview with Eddie Jemison, who's he's the actor probably best known for playing Livingston Dell in the Ocean's 11 series of movies. Yeah. And, you know, I talked to him about, you know, how powerful read-throughs are as a team-building exercise. And, you know, he said that, you know, within the movie industry, they are a very powerful bonding experience. He said that, you know, it really makes everybody realize that they're pulling for the same cause. And it really gives a team, it gives them shape and it gives them purpose. I mean, plus, of course, I mean, he echoed the point you made, you know, it's just tremendously, you know, good fun.
Yes.
And, you know, and it really does make everybody feel much more part of a team. So as a bonding exercise, as a team building exercise, wow, it's a hugely powerful experience. Yeah.
And you had mentioned to me before when we'd spoken about how certain areas or certain people are lacking in communication skills. You mentioned STEM. Or maybe you could reiterate that.
Yeah. Well, you know, the field of STEM is really fascinating. So STEM, S-T-E-M, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. It's really interesting because it is one of the most kind of global sectors that there is. There was a report that the Royal Society did a couple of years ago called Knowledge, Networks and Nations. And they found that you know, the STEM world was becoming increasingly multipolar, that science and technology was you know, increasingly being driven by bottom-up collaboration and exchanges between people in different countries.
Right.
And they found that the whole focus of STEM was really shifting from a kind of a national level to an international level. So here you have something, you know, science, technology, you know, it really is a truly global enterprise.
Well, I hear you did some work with NASA.
Well,
Is that the next project? Is that linked to the other project you're doing?
well, no, actually, well, no. When I was developing Skype Read, I was fortunate to get an interview with Julie Robinson, who's NASA's chief scientist for the International Space Station program. Yeah. So the International Space Station, that's a five-way collaboration between the Americans, the Russians, the Japanese, the Europeans, and the Canadian Space Agency. Actually, Dr. Robinson told me this fantastic story about when JAXA, which is the Japanese Space Agency, when JAXA went to NASA and asked NASA if they would like to collaborate on a piece of equipment for the International Space Station. Yeah. And they sent along some specifications and some diagrams. Now NASA thought that JAXA wanted to collaborate on building the equipment. So they went back to the Japanese and they asked some questions and a discussion began. But at one stage in the discussion, the Americans suddenly realized that the Japanese weren't asking if NASA wanted to collaborate on building the equipment. The equipment was already built. Okay. The Japanese were actually asking if the Americans wanted to collaborate on using it. But the thing is, Dr. Robinson said that this conversation had gone on for 2 years before anyone realized. Yeah. And I just love that story because I think it's a great example of how difficult global communication is. Even at the very highest level. And NASA and JAXA have a great relationship that goes back many decades of working closely together. But even there, these miscommunications, it's so easy.
Well, living in Japan, if I've experienced that 10 times, I've experienced it 20 times. where you think they're saying one thing and they're saying another, and vice versa. So anything that the stuff that you're doing that can improve global communication, I think is wonderful. Talk to me a little bit about the solar eclipse, the total eclipse project you're working on.
Yeah. So this is a project called a Global Communication and Science program. Okay. And part of the idea here is to kind of bring together the two sides of things. That you tend to always have the scientists and the STEM practitioners over here, and you tend to have the language people, the communicators over here. And one of the aims of this project is to really bring both sides together, because there's a lot that both sides can learn from each other. There's a lot that STEM practitioners can learn from language people. And of course, there's a tremendous amount that language people can learn from science, because of course science is completely fascinating and exciting to be involved with. So the aim of our Global Communication and Science project is to use solar eclipses as teachable moments that we can use to bring together students from different disciplines in different
to help
countries.
Focus them.
That's right. So the solar eclipse kind of becomes the teachable moment, the anchor for the project. Teachable moments are those things that we're always kind of looking for as teachers. Roger Bybee, who's a leading science educator in the United States, he defines teachable moments as phenomena, events, or situations that bring about a need to know and an increased motivation to learn. Yes. And he makes the point that generally we think of these teachable moments as being kind of random or unplanned. And he asks the question, what would happen if they weren't random?
You could try to create them.
If you could try to create them, or in the case of this with solar eclipses, the idea is to really kind of go looking for them, because solar eclipses are hugely powerful teachable moments. In history, they have ended battles between armies, and they've brought peace to warring nations. They've helped to deliver some of the biggest scientific breakthroughs in history. They are very, very powerful teachable moments. they're also tremendous because they really are truly global events.
And everybody knows about them, everybody's waiting for them, and it's that moment. So you use that impetus, working up to it, I guess, as in the project, and after the eclipse, following on from it.
That's right. So we're really using the eclipse as a shared experience that can really drive collaboration between people in different countries, both during the build-up to the eclipse and after the eclipse as well. Because that's the other thing about eclipses, is that they are a very, very powerful shared experience. Jay Anderson, who's a meteorologist and astronomer and one of the world's leading experts on solar eclipses, he says that, particularly after a total eclipse, after totality has finished, he says it really is a time for celebration. That, in the wake of such a powerful shared experience, conversations, interactions become very animated, very, very passionate, very emotional. And, even just casual acquaintances, can become lifelong friends in the wake of such a profound shared experience. So yes,
so you're capitalizing on that moment.
Exactly right. Capitalizing on that moment, on that kind of very strong teachable moment, and using that as the basis for collaboration between students in different countries and across different disciplines.
Yeah. So they get to mix the language with the science, and the motivation goes up, and so the enjoyment goes up, so the learning is improved.
Exactly right. Yes.
It's an interesting way. I don't think I've ever had a conversation like this about English speaking communication before. It's interesting the philosophies you're coming up with. It's just moving it outside the box somewhat and thinking of it in a different light. It's great. So talking about, thank you today, for talking about the stars with us and the constellations, but of course the stars look very different today.
Ah, yes, they do. David Bowie.
Poignant, and on that poignant note, I'll wrap it up for today. We've got a lot more things to talk about, although we don't have time today. Will you promise me you'll come back to TokyoReal and we'll carry on and we'll do it again?
I would love to. Thank you very much. Yes, it's been great talking today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
TokyoReal is sponsored by The Edge Performance Analysis Solutions. Remember, give yourself the edge.